The average Social Security recipient will receive an increase between $120 and $180 on a monthly basis, according to the Center for Responsible Federal Budgets information. We're going to take a look at how they calculated this out and what it could mean for the average Social Security recipient going into 2023 when we see the cost of living adjustments. Now, it's important to note that this cost of living adjustment won't go into effect until January of 2023 for the average Social Security recipient, and it also won't be fully public until October of 2022 when the calculation period is over. But based on what we've seen so far throughout the year, as well as what we know about what's coming up in the coming months, we're able to go ahead and calculate out this range. But first, if this video brings you value, consider subscribing. I do a ton of research for my other channel, Foresight Finance, which is linked down in the description below, and information that I can't use in those videos I put together in a raw, unscripted way so that you can get up-to-date information, and we can chop it up down in the comments below. So the Consumer Price Index is essentially how the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates increases in everyday items that consumers are buying on a year-over-year basis. So they take things like food prices, automobile prices, gas prices, energy, utilities, even things as far as clothing and discretionary purchases, and calculate out the increase on those goods year over year and come up with an inflation statistic. And this is very important for people on a fixed income because it's how their increase in income is calculated on a year-over-year basis, which you may have heard called the cost of living adjustment before. So the CPI data came in at 8.6% increase for May of 2022, which is about a 40-year high in inflation, and it's not expected to come down anytime soon, although there are signs that potentially Federal Reserve increases to interest rates may put a brief pause on the inflation statistics that we're seeing. Those on fixed incomes have been hit extremely hard during these times because if you think about it, the average worker is out there. We've seen information on wage increases, on bonuses to help offset the cost of inflation, but we're not seeing that for people that are on a fixed income. They have to wait until they receive the cost of living adjustment the next year in order to be able to be reimbursed and get ahead for the next year where they're still likely to see continued inflation. Now, it's not expected for inflation to fully subside back to levels in the 2 to 3% standard range until as far as 2024, and some people think even farther than that on the Federal Reserve Board, which means it could be a long time before people with a fixed income can get back to the standard increases that they're used to seeing. In fact, 40% of Americans who are retired use Social Security as their only form of income, which is extremely hard during times where we're seeing increases in inflation at these levels because they're having to dip into savings every single month to cover monthly deficits that they couldn't have foreseen otherwise. And even those who have other income streams like pensions or like annuities, they're often not indexed to inflation, which means essentially they get a fixed amount for the rest of their life, and that's it. So especially for income streams like pensions and annuities, they're basically losing this buying power forever. It's not getting indexed to inflation. So when they were planning for being able to have so much buying power in the future, they probably weren't planning for 40-year high inflation. And even those that are indexed are often indexed to levels like 2 or 3%, where we've seen average inflation, which means simply people on a fixed income are losing buying power in every single month. Now, Social Security recipients received an increase of 5.9% in January of 2022, but every single month throughout 2022, we've seen inflation reaching higher and higher numbers, far outpacing the inflation data that the inflation increase that they've received. Cost of living adjustments have been around for a while. In fact, they went into effect during the period of last high inflation in the 1970s, where inflation rates were 10 to 15+%. But at the time, you could also receive things like CD rates of 10 to 15%. We also saw savings rates of 8 to 10%. So a lot of the increase in inflation could simply be offset by keeping cash in the bank and having savings, but that's not the case now, where the average CD rate is just over 2% for a 10-year CD, and the average savings account rate is still under 1%. So people are being hit from all sides because they're not even able to utilize their savings to offset the inflation increases. Based on May's CPI info, inflation's already increased 7.9% versus last summer, which would translate to an increase of around $120, an increase for the average benefit of $1,650. But any increases before the calculation period, which is July, August, and September, will ultimately increase the level of raise that the cost of living will give people on Social Security. So CPI is taken from July, August, and September compared to the previous year, and that's how the cost of living adjustment is calculated out, which is why it doesn't come out until October when September's inflation data comes out. Now, the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget thinks that inflation could hit as high as 10.8% year over year by the end of the calculation period, which is September, which means this would lead to an increase of about $180 in monthly benefit for the average recipient of a $1,650 benefit now. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates out their own cost of living increase for the elderly, and they've calculated that the elderly are seeing an increase of about 8% year over year because they're not as highly impacted on things like housing costs because many of them already own their own homes, and so they're not seeing increases in rents, which is one big factor of CPI, as well as they're not commuting to work, so they're not needing as much gasoline or other fuel sources to get to work. And now there's a lot of criticism out online about how CPI numbers are being underreported in an effort to curb the benefits that the United States has to pay to fixed income recipients. And many people are showing that their bills are often 20 to 25% higher than even a year ago. So people that keep receipts are essentially putting them out there and showing that cost increases are much more than the 8.6% that are being reported. So the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget has gone to say that Social Security is only 13 years from insolvency, and that by 2035, when today's 54-year-olds reach full retirement age, and when today's already youngest retirees reach 75, that they could face a potential reduction as much as 20% in their monthly benefit. But there are easy ways to go and fix this. In fact, they've notated that according to their studies, the deficit for Social Security is only 0.8% of GDP and 2.1% of taxable payroll right now. But if we continue to wait to fix this overall deficit, then that means that we could see beneficiaries receiving benefit cuts of about 20%. And if we let the deficit continue to grow by 2040, that will end up being 1.4% of the overall GDP. So there's been a lot of calls within government to go ahead and fix this deficit by reallocating spending or potentially imposing extra taxes in order to cover up this deficit so that nobody's benefits have to get cut. Now, this goes against a lot of people who speculate that Social Security will essentially be gone by the time that they reach retirement age, but it's much more likely that we would see a reduced benefit as opposed to a full cut of benefits overall. The cost of living increases will surely be welcomed. It's really just helping people catch up with the inflation that they've already seen. So I'm curious what you're seeing out there. It's good to hear that we're seeing such a high increase in overall benefits, but have you already seen potentially your parents or yourself making cuts in your budget as a result of the higher inflation risks? Or how have you shifted your overall spending? I'm always curious. Let's chop it up down in the comments below. I'd love to be able to get a ton of comments on this channel and have full conversations, so definitely start out with the first video here. I really appreciate you watching until the end. If you have, let me know some other topics that you'd be interested in hearing covered. I do a ton of studying. I've got a ton of topics already laid out for this video, but I'm always curious to see what the audience wants to see. Thanks for stopping by. Catch you in the next one.